So everyone, hello and welcome. Thank you to coming to this presentation. As a reminder, our sessions are being recorded. My name is Jennifer Robinson, and I will be the moderator for this ADEIL conference session. Before we begin, on behalf of ADEIL, we'd like to thank our generous sponsor, Noodle, and our host, Old Dominion University. We're thankful for their contributions in making this event possible. At some point during this session, you might get a quick message from me because we are choosing door prize winners in each session. So if you see that, I'm just asking for your email address so we can get a hold of you. In the meantime, and the reason we are really here, I would like to thank you for joining us for practical use of ChatGPT to understand AI submissions and assignments. Please welcome Joel Tscherne.
Just don't bother me for my email address if I win a door prize, because you already know it. So anyway, thanks to everyone for coming in. I know there's been a lot of good sessions already, and there's plenty to choose from. So I appreciate any time that you chose to be with me. I will try to keep things moving so that if there's questions or comments at the end, we have time. But hopefully most everything I talk about should be pretty straightforward, but obviously if you have questions, you can leave them in the chat. If there's something worth bringing up right away, I certainly will. Otherwise, we'll sort of try to find time at the end if needed. So hopefully you'll find this to be learning, but also information gathering, and hopefully we all learn together. So the agenda is I'll give you a little bit of background about me, an introduction to what I'm going to be speaking about, just some discussion about the whole concept of technology in education, since ChatGPT and other sources are very similar to the kinds of things we've been dealing with ever since technology has become more important in education. What happened last November when ChatGPT was first announced, and then we'll spend some time on a few practical examples that I've pulled together from my own experiences as a teacher. And then the conclusion, and like I said before, if time or if needed, we'll do questions at the end. So my background real quickly, I have a master's degree in history and a library science degree. I currently am associate faculty at University of Arizona Global Campus, mostly teaching information literacy. I also am history adjunct faculty at Southern New Hampshire University, obviously teaching history. One of the interesting aspects of pretty much all the teaching I do is that most of the time the students have to do research. Therefore, I am been in the middle of what we would consider to be the kinds of problems and issues and considerations we have to think about when students have to do research and present information from various sources. I'm a former academic and public librarian, and then I'm also a podcast host for the New Books Network. So let's get started. Here is an article, the headline for the article. It's from rollingstone.com. Professor flunks all his students after ChatGPT falsely claims it wrote their papers. Well, first off, if you read the article, you suddenly discover he didn't flunk all of his students. It wasn't like there are a lot of issues involved in the article, but it still, I think, illustrates the point I wanted to make, and the reason why I'm bringing this up first. As the quote from at the bottom says, everyone would be receiving an X in the course, he explained, because he had used ChatGPT, it's the OpenAI chat bot, it's actually called ChatGPT, to test whether they've used the software to write the papers, and the bot claimed to have authored every single one. This is the typical situation that I suspect people were seeing early on, especially, although this article is from May, so it's not that long ago. And it's because when ChatGPT appeared, in many ways, it seemed like it created a major change or a major rumble in the education field. Although at the time it happened, it came out, there were some question as to whether it would really make any difference at all at the time. But for a variety of reasons, partly media related and partly because of some of the reactions, ChatGPT and other AI services have suddenly become much more important and have come to the top of our regular things that we have to think about. So an article like this shows where somebody who quite frankly, and then it talks about it in the article, the person admitted he didn't know really anything about it. He just tested it on his own. And or however he chose to do this test, that he somehow said that these students had done their papers with ChatGPT. So that's the idea where we want to start getting away from that part of where we all were, or many of us were at the beginning of ChatGPT back in November and later, and get into where we are now and what we can do to improve, knowing that it's here. It's not going to suddenly disappear tomorrow. And as we've heard in some of the other sessions, it continues to change. It continues to change in many ways, both plus minuses, and other kinds of changes that we want to make sure we're aware of. So I want to talk briefly about technology in education because, as I've already mentioned, and those of us who are in distance learning obviously know this, technology is incredibly important for education in many ways. Most of us, or many of us, depending on our ages, attended classes in live sessions, meaning in regular brick and mortar schools. And while we may have had some form of technology, depending on our ages, it's not the kind of thing that the average student these days has to even consider, or instructors or other support people, where now we depend so much on technology that it's important that we keep our minds on what it is and what technology's importance, and some of the examples as we continue to talk about AI. The most obvious, simple things like spell checkers and grammar checkers. We have gotten to a point now where those are things that are in any word processing program, even in many of the learning management systems have that built in. But I wanted to show you a real brief example. Just back when I used to teach information literacy in a live classroom setting, this is an example I would give when we started talking about word processing programs. So let me bring this up. Notice I would type out this sentence, or a sentence like this, without exactly as it's shown here. And I would invariably say, can somebody tell me what that red line means, that squiggly red line means? And most of the time, the first person would tell me the word's misspelled. And sometimes people may have thought I was being pedantic about it, but I wasn't, because I was trying to make a point. That's not what that red line means. That red line means the computer doesn't recognize the word. So obviously, in this case, the word's misspelled. But ChatGPT down here, it just doesn't happen to be in the computer's dictionary. This is an example of how how I used to work with students to try to make them understand that a computer and other kinds of technologies are theirs as tools, but you still have to learn how to use them. And we as faculty have to consider these things the same way. And that's why things like learning more about ChatGPT and other sources or other systems can be so useful. So anyway, very small example, but I felt it was something that I wanted to mention since I used to use it all the time. Obviously, then Turnitin and other similar plagiarism sites we depend on a great deal as well. And we obviously know that when ChatGPT first came out, there was a lot of issues related to how Turnitin was handling a possible AI, and we'll talk about that later. But Turnitin is another example of how we depend on technology. Yet, as you know, if you use Turnitin, you still have to learn how to use it to make sure that you understand that when Turnitin says something is from another source, doesn't necessarily mean it's plagiarized. For example, some of the courses I teach, students repeat information. They start a project in 1 week and they add on to it in later weeks. Well, as you can imagine, when it goes through Turnitin the following week, at first, Turnitin's likely to mark a lot of it as being reused work. But in this case, it's a matter of understanding, well, some of that is because the reused work is the students' work that they're just moving along. So learning how to use Turnitin and not just saying, okay, the number says 85, therefore you must have plagiarized. It's the same concept of that we're continuing to talk about. Making sure you understand what the technology does so that you don't make a mistake, or better yet, that you learn and can actually help students get a better understanding. Tutoring sites. We obviously know now that many schools have tutoring places, whether it's writing, tutoring with the actual classes within the libraries at the schools. These are important ways that we are able to use technology to help students learn more, even though they're in a distant site. And so we depend a great deal about them with it when it comes to education. Search engines. Obviously, students are used to using things like Google and Yahoo and all kinds of other search engines. And so understanding how they work and making sure that we get a better sense as to how to use them and how they differ, or say from a library searching. Understanding these can be very helpful when you're working with students who are doing research. And then, of course, now where we are today, which is with ChatGPT and other AI tools. I keep meaning that other AI tools because, as I think was mentioned during the keynote, we have a tendency of only focusing on ChatGPT, forgetting that there's plenty of others out there. And as we know, and I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes, Google and Microsoft have their own projects, as do other people. So we want to start to get away from assuming that the only one we have to think about is ChatGPT, even though they all tend to have similar ways of working. So let's talk a little bit about what happened when ChatGPT was officially released back in November of 2022. Seems like such a long time ago, but it was less than a year ago. And for some of us, when it first came out, it was the kind of thing where you didn't think about it too much, but then suddenly, for whatever reason, or for a variety of reasons, it got picked up in a lot of different ways, not even education related. Example, 60 Minutes did not only one, but two stories about AI, and the one even before ChatGPT came out. So the idea that this was coming or was here, I think seemingly surprised us, but also I feel like sometimes the reaction might have been a little higher than it needed to be. And what tended to set in, depending on where you were or who you were, there was a certain amount of panic. And during that initial release reaction, there were suddenly you'd start to read, education has changed. We're never going to be able to trust anything anymore. There was a lot of hyperbole. And while some of those things may turn out to have been true, that there is a certain amount of things that we have to be careful about, we have to learn more about, I think to a large extent, now that this initial period has started to calm down, we're all starting to figure out, well, wait a minute, it's here. We have to live with it in some way, shape, or form. Let's see if we can figure out, number one, what it is, how it works, what we can do to make sure that it's not being used in an incorrect way by students. And as other programs in the today's present conference has shown, there are a lot of good reasons and good ways that you can use ChatGPT and other AI. One of the things that happened early on is that Turnitin started to try to develop AI tools to try to find out whether there was AI content in assignments. And what happened after a short period of time, it suddenly got announced, or at least at the places I worked, it got announced, it came out, we suddenly started getting an AI grade. And almost immediately there was pushback because sometimes it was showing somebody as using AI, and there was absolutely no way, number one, there was no way to prove it. At least with plagiarism, you can usually say, well, you assign, this is what you put in, and it doesn't have, you have evidence. With anything from ChatGPT or other AI sources, you often don't have evidence that somebody did something. And they could say they didn't, but once again, there's no way to prove it. So one of the things that I'm glad to see is that we backed away a little bit in a lot of places, where instead of just accusing everyone, as that Rolling Stone article said, we started to look at it and say, okay, what do we need to do to make sure that we understand what we're looking at, just as importantly, so that we don't make the mistakes of accusing somebody that didn't, or more importantly, when students start asking questions about it, and obviously you can imagine it's the kind of thing that might come up, that we have a way to answer those questions. Then the other thing is that both Google and Microsoft have already been working on their own AI programs, and Microsoft Bing AI came out. And so we're in a position now where we're starting to see more and more. while ChatGPT still seems to get the lion's share of the publicity, so to speak, there are plenty of others. And the more we learn how they work and how they don't work, I think will help us be more prepared as we continue to go forward. Obviously, as we know, as I mentioned, the media in various ways, not only just articles, but also picked up the stories. And the next thing we knew, it became such a big story that in the education field, where it seems like we all agreed it was going to be something we had to be careful about, it, I think, helped to push things into an even higher frenzy to an extent. And that, of course, is where educational institutions immediately figured out, well, we have to come up with ways. And the word we constantly used, I think, or a lot of places I saw, was the words like counteract or make sure people aren't cheating. And academic integrity is very important. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it isn't. But one of the things you start to find out is, okay, what kinds of academic, where does AI fit into academic integrity, and where it's important or not important in a particular situation. So with that, then, let's actually start looking at a few examples. Now, as I've already mentioned, I teach at 2 different institutions. In both cases, students work on a research project. One is historical and the other is more general. And in each case, the students are allowed to come up with a question or come up with an event to research or a topic to research, and then develop various aspects of it. One of the great things, I will say this, and I'll mention this again when we get to my conclusions. In each case, the students start with developing their questions first, their essays, their topic, and then questions, and then start their research. So they're not writing from scratch at the very beginning. We're asking them, okay, show me what as we go through each week, I want to see what sources you used. And that's a simple way that I can think of where if you know that a student found the information in a specific source and it shows up in their paper, that's going to make it, that's an example of how we can actually use that information in the way assignments are developed. But I'll mention that again in later when we get farther along. Let me switch over. And the first thing I'm going to do is go to a simple search engine in this case, before we get to ChatGPT. And I tend to use DuckDuckGo only because they don't track anything. I just have gotten into the habit. So in my history class, one of the classes I teach, students are given a list of 12 different historical events, and they have to write about one of the 12 events. So in this case, I'm going to ask DuckDuckGo, what is a good historical research question related to the Chernobyl disaster? Obviously, one of the first things the students have to do once they pick out their topic event is come up with a research question. Now, if you know, I mean, I tend to teach history on a general education level, meaning non-historian students. So this is something that can be quite difficult because it's an idea that's not necessarily always familiar to them. So they sometimes will start to look other places to try to get some help. So if a student goes into a search engine and basically asks that question, let's see what kind of results they're likely to get. And of course, you're going to see different answers depending on where you ask the question. If you do it in Google or Yahoo or different search engines, you may get different information. But let's go ahead and just take a quick glance at some of the results here. Right at the top, Reddit. Well, that you can obviously see that somebody went on Reddit and say, give me an idea of a research question. Now, whether this person just happened to be in the same class that I'm teaching, who knows? But it's not that, but you can see that they could look at that as a way to find some ideas. Simple ones here. This next one is pretty obvious. It's directly from my school, and it actually is the library guide that we have set up at Southern New Hampshire, and then some other sources. Now, the good thing is none of these are what I would consider to be particularly bad sources to use if you're brainstorming. And that's really what you're doing at the beginning. Somebody trying to develop a research question, they're just learning a little bit here and there, and then trying to come up with a way to come up with a good research question. So using a Google site, or any kind of search engine, they're likely to see interesting results, and some of which are going to be useful. And I have no problem if they came back to me with a question they developed this way, because they're working on it on their own too. And to be brutally honest, I don't think we would disagree that most of the time coming up with a brand new idea of what to write about when it comes to something this well known would be very difficult. Now, another example, then let's take this same example though, and let's go over to ChatGPT and let's ask the same question. I'm not going to go into a lot of discussion of what ChatGPT looks like, because I think you've probably seen it in other sessions today. So the first thing, when I type this in, what ChatGPT, I'm doing it as badly as that professor did. We had a number of questions, but rather than just being a list of questions, this ChatGPT gave me some basic concepts as to what each question relates to. So this first question deals with how Soviet secrecy might have made a difference, and so on and so forth. So at first glance, once again, this is no worse than any kind of brainstorming they might do. The idea is they want to know more about something, but they have to come up with it. And the way they chose to do it is to brainstorm it using a computer. We have plenty of ways that we teach students how to brainstorm. And this is just, to me, the way it shows is a simple way to do some brainstorming. Now, here's one of the things that you have to think about, and especially when it comes to something like, for me, with a history class. Sometimes I will get a question like this: memory and commemoration. How has the memory and commemoration of the Chernobyl disaster evolved over time? Now, that question in and of itself isn't a bad question, but my concern always when it comes to history is, does it really focus on the event itself, or are we asking about present day? And when we talk about history, we tend to want to focus on the past. And sometimes one of the things I will have noticed when I've done checkouts in ChatGPT is it will often come up with questions that would require more current information in order to adequately answer. Now I could do a regeneration and we'll get some more. And it's the same kind of thing. These are all questions, none of which are particularly bad, and are also not the kind of question the average student wouldn't come up with in some way, shape, or form anyway. This is one of those things that I'm going to mention again towards the end, and that's the idea that often when we're talking about any kind of situation, when a student is putting in work, one of the things we always look at, how does it compare to other writing that they've done? If I had a student who had done a few discussion posts and here and there, and I got a sense of what their writing is, some of these questions, if they came up with these word for word, that would make me wonder a little bit. Not that they were necessarily cheating, but that they could have been using some source to make it a little more easy for them to come up with their questions. So here's an example, like I say, of how I would use ChatGPT in order to get a better sense of, if one of my students did something like this, what kind of results are they likely to get? In the same way, I can change some other questions. In fact, we'll do the other class that I teach, an example from that class, and we'll see what we get from that one. And it's the same kind of thing, but it still comes down to the same thing, because students are generally going to either go to Google and just start typing terms, or something like this. So here the question was, what are 3 useful research questions related to climate change? Now, this one I find more interesting only because it seems like this particular case, these questions, many of them are very complex. There's an example of how, while the student might not necessarily use ChatGPT, it's the kind of wording that would tell me, okay, well, wait a minute, this is a little bit higher level than I'm expecting at this point, especially with basic research. So it's an example of where I might look at their questions and try to get a better sense of whether they really understand what they're asking, and more importantly, what kind of sources they can use to find their answers. So it's an example of where ChatGPT can help me with getting a better sense of things. Let's go over to my search engine and try that question and see what happens there. Of course, right at the top, we get thesis help, the kind of websites that are out there to help with these kind of things. And it's not unusual that you're going to see these kind of things regularly. But I'm not sure if you ask me about it, I'm going to say, well, which is worse or which is better as far as brainstorming is concerned. I don't think either of them in and of themselves, as long as what you're doing is just coming up with ideas and in this case, trying to come up with research questions. That's different, for example, than some of the issues with ChatGPT where people are worried about full papers being written by, and we're not really talking about that on this level. So the key is making sure that as we continue on with our class teaching is that we think about, okay, how does a source like ChatGPT and other AI sources, what can they do? And then that way, the more we use them as instructors or interested parties, the more we keep up with what's changing, and more importantly, the more likely that we will be able to sense or get a better idea of how it's being used by students. And so these examples, while very brief, are the kind of thing that I think we all can find a lot of use for if we use them when we're looking at something. And in some cases, we may have a question where the student's asked to talk about their research in later weeks and get a sense as to how ChatGPT might respond to that and give its own answers. And the good thing is that the more you take your time to learn more and be more aware of what AI can do and what are the pitfalls, the more likely that we will be able to help our students, and just as importantly, make sure that students understand the negatives as well as the positives of using these kind of sources. So if we go back to my PowerPoint, basically, there are some points that I wanted to make sure that we talk about in more detail here at the end. What I've been obviously saying, and what I think just about everybody at the conference has been talking about, make sure you take the time to experiment with these tools. You early on, when it first, and this is something that I've had conversations with a colleague, where people got panicky right at the beginning, but a lot of the panic was based on lack of knowledge because people weren't looking carefully themselves. It became easier to just react to what we were being told. But then over time, the more you play around with them or the practice with them or use them yourself for various methods, you will suddenly discover, yes, there are pitfalls, but there are also plenty of ways that you can use these kind of tools that will help you better use them and understand how they work. And like I say, as we've already talked about, there are more of them now, and there's going to be other ones. And understanding those kind of things will only help us going forward because they're going to be out there. Be careful with jumping to conclusions. This is where we can all get into some problems. I will admit it, early on in last year, I had a student submit an assignment at one of the schools I was in and turned it in, flagged it with a high AI score. And obviously I handled it correctly, thank goodness. I contacted the student. I said, everything looks good as far as what you wrote, but I wanted to let you know that this is what I've been told. And the student, quite rightly in this particular case, I think was able to convince me that they hadn't used AI. But it was a perfect example of where if we're not careful, just like Turnitin with plagiarism, we want to be very careful about not jumping to conclusions and automatically assuming that just because we find something doesn't make it automatically wrong. It's sort of like my spell check example where one word is misspelled, the other one isn't in the dictionary. I think in the keynote she mentioned this, but she used a different term. I used to use the term garbage in, garbage out, and it's the same idea. Always remember, we have our brains too, make sure we use them to avoid jumping to conclusions. Now, you may get students who start to ask you questions about whether it's permissible to use AI or if there's any way you can use AI. And this is something that I think is useful for going down into the university levels at various schools and start to see, okay, are other institutions already having these kind of conversations? Because sometimes, yes, we want to, not only do we want to make sure people aren't using it in a bad way, but we want to make sure, are there ways that we, if a student asks especially, that we can help them understand what AI can do and what are the things to watch out for. So considering ways to come up with ways that if a student asks you in particular, or even if you see something that you think is worth mentioning, how do you approach that student? How do you discuss the issues, such as, you know, you don't want to, obviously, as I've pointed out in my other examples, is AI is not the same necessarily as plagiarism in the way it shows up, and therefore how you approach it can be very important. Make sure, and this is something that I think it's generally the case, make sure assignments require sources early on. For example, I mentioned this earlier during the first part of my session. In the 2 classes that I teach regularly at the 2 institutions, in each case, the students have to write a research assignment of some sort. They come up with their questions first, but then before they actually get to the point of doing any real writing, they have to start looking for sources. They have to do the research part. Well, that's the kind of thing that when you do that, you're pushing the student into showing you how they're doing their work. It's sort of like the old math thing, show your work. The positive is if you design assignments that require a student to in some way, shape, or form show their work, the more likely you'll be able to monitor it, and more importantly, you'll be able to make sure that the student is doing the work the proper way. So anytime assignments, if you're involved in that, or if you have any ability to talk to people who design assignments for a class you teach, try to make sure that whenever you can, if you start it down up, you're more likely to be able to make sure that the student is properly following directions and, more importantly, avoiding pitfalls. So that's the amount of information I had to provide. I know I went through some of this pretty quickly, but I wanted to make sure that if there was a need for questions at the end, that we did. This is all my own personal experience to a large extent. And it's like I said before, I have found that the more I have learned, the more likely that I'm going to be able to at least have some amount of ability to understand things better and to do a better job as we continue to go through this new pathway of AI. And I'd like to thank you for your time. If there's anyone that wants to have any questions or comments, now would be a good time, and I'll turn it back over to Jen.
Hi, Joel. Thank you so much for this. It's such great reminders of how I can guide my students through some of the landmines of AI, but also celebrate some of the exciting things in AI. It looks like Steve has a question for you.
Hi, Joel. Thank
Hey.
you for the presentation. My question has to do with how you go about strategically identifying what areas of the, I guess you'd call the educational narrative in your context, what are the areas that you want to conserve to the more traditional expectations for students to do things the way they've always done them, and then other parts of that narrative where you can say, I'm okay with them using this tool, this artificial intelligence tool, and how you make that distinction about what is permissible and what is not. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And it's probably one of those things that I'm lucky in the sense that every class that I teach at this point, and I'm sure a lot of you are the same way. I know people teach different things, but virtually every assignment I have in my classes tend to have a research component, and mostly library, and we tend to push that. And so those are the kind of things where I'm always going to expect you to follow established ways. Obviously, you want somebody to do library research or research for scholarly sources, and I tend to push the library. In one school, we actually have live sessions where we teach students the basics of research in the library, and they understand suddenly that they can get what they need and it's not as difficult or as scary as they think they do. Now, as far as things like a research question, I probably would look at the question, and as long as it fits the general bill of what the requirement was, that it's not too general, because obviously any research question, somebody says their research question is, who was Benjamin Franklin? I would tell them that's way too general. So that's nothing new. Also, but if it's too specific too, in the same way, I've had students say, when was the Declaration of Independence signed? Well, obviously that's not a research question either. So I still am using old style history and research tools to come up with those kind of things. As far as somebody using it as a brainstorming method, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because they're not really coming up with original information. They're just trying to come up with ways to approach a topic in a way that's interesting to them. We let it, depending on the course, they're allowed to choose their research topic. Then depending once again on what their class level is, coming up with research questions may be brand new to them. So they're going to reach out to whatever helps them get a focus on it. And in online learning, where we can't really do it in a normal classroom setting, where we can't brainstorm together, students might go into other ways to do their brainstorming. And as you could see, when in my example using a search engine on the web, they're getting pointed to sources, and then they're more likely to possibly continue to use that source to help them continue on with the assignment. Or at least ChatGPT, the schedule, the assignment, the questions, most of them seem logical. And as long as the student understood them, I don't think I would have a problem with them.
So if I interpret what you're saying correctly, is you sort of carved out the difference between the creative aspects of it and the mechanical aspects of it. Is that a fair way to,
right.
Is that too broad, or is that somewhat in the ballpark?
It's the part of us that's our, we're all professors or teachers or instructors or some way, shape, or form with education. We use our educational knowledge to do more than just, when we're grading a paper, you have to look at something and say, does it meet the requirement, and that kind of thing. So there is always that art part of it, the part where there's interpretation, and other part, and then there's the other parts where do they do all the steps correctly? And to me, in a research paper, as long as they can show their sources, that's the important part to me. Did they do their proper research? Did they do those steps? And what ChatGPT does or doesn't do is less important to me in that case, because short of them trying to get the entire paper from ChatGPT, which can be done, they're not going to be able to do that based on the, because they're going to have had to do too many assignments before the final paper to build up to that final paper, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Joel, Art has a question in the chat, and he says there are now AI tools specifically developed for research. So how do you verify that the student actually conducted the research?
Well, there's an example of, I'll be honest with you. I have to experiment with AI tools to better understand how they work. I mean, these are the kind of tools that we will have, as new things come out, we're just going to have to look at them. The one thing I will tell you is that from my experience, especially teaching on a general education level, as I mostly do, this is where sometimes experience counts, that you can tell if a student's referring to a source that appeared in some obscure Chinese magazine or journal versus Time magazine. You have to use your guideline, your normal idea of thinking, okay, where did they get this? And that's where looking at those kind of sources and what kind of information they tend to put out will be helpful to emphasize and change. It's just, to me, I think AI has just become one more professional development step that we have to put in our baskets of things that we have to keep up with, because it is something that's changing very quickly. And I'll have to take a closer look at that. I'm one of those people who I haven't had a chance to look at everything perfectly, and I definitely will continue on. So I guess that's the best answer I can provide.
Rob linked a paper from Temple regarding the efficacy of Turnitin, which he says is not good. I'm interested in that because we use Turnitin.
Yeah, the AI part of Turnitin, at one university I teach, we had the AI generated thing and then turned it off because it was not trustworthy. And it came down to, I think, because things suddenly took off so quickly last year, certain things got done quickly, and I think mistakenly. And it's better to back off, redevelop, and think about it before we can better be more careful. So and that's the kind of reason. In my example I gave during the presentation of a student who got a high AI rating, and when I talked to her, I agreed that she hadn't used AI.
I had the AI come up 100% for a student to find out she ran her paper through Grammarly to help her with editing. So there are always those challenges.
Yeah, and I didn't even, that's what I meant with grammar checkers in my history part. I didn't really talk about Grammarly per se, but it's not that different from these other kinds of sources. And any source that learns from what information it gets or what kind of questions it gets is basically AI. It learns from whatever you do. It's sort of on the simplest level, spell checker learns because you add other words. So you have to hope they're correct. And it goes back to the garbage in, garbage out. The biggest mistake you could ever make is in spell checker, go ahead and tell it to remember a word, and it turned out you misspelled it in the first place.
Any other questions or comments for Joel? Ollie agrees with your statement.
Yeah, I've got the chat up now because I'm not talking.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Grammarly rewrites are any kind of grammar checker and other kinds of checkers like that rewrite. Does it rewrite into a format that might get caught by a Turnitin or some other plagiarism checker? We have to, goes back to education and technology. All of these things there are similarities that we've been considering all along. Maybe this will help us remind ourselves of those kind of things too. Well, I think we ended up filling up almost a full 45 minutes. That's a good thing. Big problem with presentations is being done with too much time on your hands rather than having to rush at the end. So
no, yours was perfect. Yeah. Perfect.
Anyway, I really appreciate we got a good turnout for this. It's a subject that I think we all are doing a good job by being here today and learning more and just developing ideas. And I think it's great that you are all finding it to be important to you to be here and take this and take it back to your schools and start the conversations if they're not already going on. And I think we'll find ourselves all getting better so that we can be on top of the situation instead of trying to climb our way up. And I want to thank Jen Robinson for being my moderator here today. She and I know each other quite well, so it worked out fine. And in fact, I think I'm on a session with her on Saturday totally from work, so that's fine too. Anyway, thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of the session. There's one more set of programming, one more breakouts, and then the conclusion. So really hope you all continue to have a great conference, and thank you for being with me today.
Thank you so much, Joel, for your presentation. And as Joel said, for everybody for attending, please be sure to fill out the conference evaluation form at the end of the day. I've put that link in the chat if you have not received it, or maybe it's just in the 30 tabs you have open while you're multitasking and need to see it again. Please enjoy the rest of the conference, and we'll see you at the end of the day. Take care.